the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Father Robert Spitzer is the founder and president of the Magus Center. Can you start by explaining what the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo are for those who aren't familiar?
That's right. Well, you just are going to be encountering a couple of readings in the upcoming days of John and Peter going to the tomb. This is from the Gospel of John. And as you shall see, when they peer in, they first peer in, you could see they say, well, we saw the burial cloths there, and then, rolled up in a separate place by itself was the so-called napkin or face cloth. And so what we're talking about here is the shroud, that's the burial cloth in which the body was laid in, and the face cloth, which we now call the face cloth of Oviedo, is rolled up in a place by itself. That cloth was not used to bury the person. That cloth was wrapped around the head and the face to basically take Jesus down from the cross and then to carry him, transport him over to the tomb, after which, the cloth would be removed. People didn't, to say a macabre thought, I mean, basically they have to tie the chin up underneath so that the jaw won't be flopping around, and there's pleural edema fluid coming out of the nose, and there's also, of course, blood everywhere on that face, not just from the crown of thorns, but from a severe beating. Some of those blows hitting Jesus right smack dab on the, above the eye, etc. Pretty brutal stuff. And of course, they wanted to, out of respect for the deceased, to bring him over with the face cloth covering his face, and to make sure, of course, that all the terrible effusions of blood and pleural edema fluid wouldn't be visible. So that was taken off, and it was put in a special place by itself. It has no image on it because, of course, the image comes from radiation that we'll talk about in a moment, radiation that occurred 36 hours after the body is laid in the tomb. So what we have on the burial cloth, though, that's the big one, a 14-foot linen cloth by 3.5 feet, and it is the most unique image we have in the world because you can see definite, three-dimensional imaging. You can see imaging from inside the body. You can see that the image was not produced by any substance of any kind. So there's no paint residues, dye residues, rub residues, vapor residues. It wasn't produced by a substance. It's actually produced by a very delicate etching that occurs because of basically electrical charges that are being produced by proton and deuteron radiation. I'll talk about that again in the evidence for the resurrection in a moment. But just think of it this way. This is the most unique image we have in the world. It has to be radiation, right? Because there's all kinds of places on the cloth that never touch the body at all. So you're going to have action at a distance, which another word for that is radiation. So you could see no substance was used to produce it. The image is lying on the uppermost surface of the fibrils of the cloth. It's a three-dimensional negative, like a photographic negative image that's emblazoned on a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. It has imaging from the inside of the body. We simply have no other historical artifact, no other image in the world that has this. The only three-dimensional imaging we have is from MRIs that come from the late 20th and 21st centuries. So this cloth is definitely unique as a first century image. There was a 1988 carbon dating that was done on the shroud. That 1988 carbon dating showed a date between 1260 to 1390. That date has been absolutely debunked. No question about it. There is, by the way, that's a little 8-centimeter segment that was taken from the cloth. It was subdivided into 3 parts and then 4 parts each, so 12 subparts total, but 8 centimeters is only 2.5 inches. It came from the foot area of the cloth at the outermost right edge. So you can see pretty clearly that, if you look at that date sequentially, so if you start from the edge that's closest to the body, you get a carbon dating of 1410. And if you go out to the outer dating of that segment, you get dating of 1150. So you have 250 years of variance within that little 2.5 inch, a segment of cloth that was used for a sample. Now you look at it and it's exactly even. So the further away you get from the body, the earlier the date becomes. The closer to the body, the nearer the date is to the present moment. And you go, well, what could have done this? By the way, first of all, if you have more than 2 standard deviations of difference in like I said, this 8 centimeter cloth, 2 standard deviations from the mean, difference. Already, there has to be a systematic error in there, a glaring systematic error, and you need to produce a cause of that. But you certainly can't, and the scientific community certainly should not have declared that to be a proper dating. As it was found out, Damon, who had done the publishing on this, had elevated the margins of error in a very unusual procedure, for estimating, margin of error, and snuck the results through. So if you really look at it, I mean, we now have 4 separate groups that have debunked it. Dr. Tristan Casabianca and his team at the Italian National Labs, and also several other teams have shown. They finally got, by the way, the raw data from the carbon dating in 2017. This dating occurred in 1988. They had to repeatedly ask the British Museum to give them the raw dating so they could make a statistical analysis of, the dating samples. It was held onto for nearly 30 years, 29 years, and finally suing on the basis of a Freedom of Information request. The British Museum relinquished the data and what did we find? There's so much heterogeneity and stratification in the subgroups of these of the dating samples. There's no possible way you could date this sample to the Middle Ages or any other age for that matter. It's just plain wrong. And the systematization from 1410 all the way down to 1150 in a single sample indicates definitely the carbon dating is an error. It is not pointing to a probable, any kind of a probable date, Middle Ages or otherwise. We know the reason for this now. The reason is neutrons, and I can explain that momentarily. But I know this is probably a little above some people's heads, but just think of it this way. Linen cloths are filled with nitrogen, and nitrogen 13 in linen is frequently accompanied by nitrogen 14, an isotope. Mm-hmm. Now, if you've got a lot of nitrogen 14 in that linen cloth, and you've got these neutrons that are blasting out of this body, and they did, for 1/10,000th of a second, you have a very intense neutron fluence coming from that body, which I'll prove in a moment. But for the time being, just recognize that when you have N14 plus a neutron, so remember, the neutrons are coming off the body. The neutron density is going to be highest, nearest to the body, and then lowest as it gets further and further away from the body. And when you just remember that, remember, N14 plus neutron yields C14 plus proton. Well, what is measured in a carbon-14 dating test? C14, carbon 14. So now, if you've got a neutron effusion coming from that body, and it is, spraying out all over the cloth and being absorbed by that linen cloth, which it would be, every time a neutron 14 atom is absorbing that neutron, what's happening is, of course, it's turning into C14 and elevating the date, just continuously elevating. Now let's get back to that spread that you see in the sample from 1410 down to 1150. There's a software that we use in atomic power plants called Monte Carlo N particle software. By the way, you know that this software is very accurate because the Atomic Energy Commission uses it to monitor the safety. You don't want stray neutrons on high velocities, right, coming off of a nuclear power plant. So they use this Monte Carlo spread, the scattering, Monte Carlo scattering to measure it. But the main thing to remember is it's very accurate software. So what does it predict would happen if there was a neutron effusion of 2 times 10 to the 18th neutrons coming off that body in about 1/10,000th of a second? What it predicts is that you should have a movement from just about mid-first century AD to the edge of the sample closest to the body, which should measure just about 1400. What's the carbon dating? 1410. And go out just 2.5 inches to the outer edge of the shroud. And what does Monte Carlo predict? Why, you should have a reading of about 1150, more or less. Now, that almost perfectly corresponds not only to the groupings, but to the subgroupings of every single carbon dating. So that you think to yourself, well, that's amazing. If you can just prove that there was a neutron emission that would do this, this perfect mathematical correlation would explain why you have an errant dating from between, like I said, 1410 to 1150. So let's see the other reasons why we know there are neutrons that are coming off that body. By the way, not just neutrons, but proton-deuteron infusion too. And again, that would be about 2 times 10 to the 18th protons and deuterons. That's a lot of protons and deuterons, and it comes off in 1/10,000th of a second. Same thing. The protons and the deuterons are producing the actual image, and they're doing it by embedding themselves in the uppermost surface of the fibrils of that cloth. And when they do that, they produce an electrical charge. The electrical charge causes, a little bit of, etching into the cloth. So it just has a very superficial depth, but a very, very precise superficial depth in the etching of that cloth. So much so that you can actually get 3-dimensional imaging on the cloth. That 3-dimensional imaging is so good, you can actually use a VPA image analyzer from NASA, and you can build yourself a nice little bronze statue, right, of 3 dimensions of what Jesus actually looked like. And so, and by the way, it has been done. And if you come to the Shroud Experience here in Orange County, we have a big display called the Shroud Experience. We do have one of those 3-dimensional statues, bronze statues. We've got a VPA image analyzer. You can see the scientific studies that have been done, explained by yours truly. But I can almost assure you, if you start looking at the fluorescing evidence, you can see that the neutrons are entering the linen cloth because it actually, you can see the patterns in the fluorescent reflection. So if you take ultraviolet light, you shine them on the linen cloth, it will reflect back, and that reflection is called fluorescence. And so you can see that the intensity of the fluorescence, guess what, is closer when you're closest to the higher, when you're closest to the body. And of course, it is much lower as you move away from the body toward the edge of the cloth. Not surprising. And it corresponds exactly to what a neutron scattering would be. So you can again see neutrons will affect the fluorescing of the linen cloth. So now you have 2 data points: extremely high carbon-14 readings and extremely high fluorescence readings. The closer to the body, the higher the reading. The furthest from the body, the lower the reading. Now you take a look at the blood, and the blood is bright red. And you say to yourself, well, gee, blood, if you leave it in the open air, it turns to dark red and then to brown and then finally to black after a certain amount of time in the open air. Well, this has been in the open air for 2,000 years, and I can prove that date to you momentarily, but for 2,000 years. But the main thing to remember is that for 2,000 years, it should all be black. And why in the world should you have bright red bloodstains, over 100 bright red bloodstains on the shroud? Answer, neutrons again. If you irradiate that blood with neutron radiation, and then you put it in close proximity, or actually, if you just put it out in an exhibition or ultraviolet light that comes in from the sun, ultraviolet light hits that blood, it turns from black to bright red almost immediately. It's the neutron radiation again. And by the way, the carbonyl bonds inside that cloth, those carbonyl bonds, there's a huge high percentage of what we call crystalline carbonyl bonds. And normally a linen cloth has very weak, much weaker linear carbonyl bonds. How did they switch to crystalline ones? Well, neutrons are again the answer. You blast those neutrons through. Unlike protons and deuterons that are positively charged, neutrons have no charge. The protons and deuterons, because they're positively charged, they will literally hit the uppermost surface of the fibrils. They will cause that electrical charge, which will cause, the little etching into the shroud and the yellowish coloration that we see on the shroud. But the neutrons, they won't stop at the uppermost surface of the fibrils. They'll blast right through the cloth. And when they blast right through the cloth, they break up a lot of weak linear carbonyl bondings. And when they reconstitute themselves, they become stronger crystalline carbonyl bondings. We now have so much evidence of neutrons, a very strong neutron emission. We can make a very precise prediction of how much that neutron influence was. As I said, 2 times 10 to the 18th neutrons and 2 times 10 to the 18th protons and deuterons. The former producing, of course, the age discrepancy, and the protons and deuterons producing the image and other things. Let me just, if I have a few more minutes, I can actually go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Time.
So I could just get to some of the really remarkable things. Let's suppose that this neutron and proton deuteron fluence happened, which I have no doubt of because there's an overwhelming amount of evidence for this. And by the way, it explains all 46 image, blood, and cloth enigmas on the Shroud of Turin, all of them. So I think I have very good support for believing this. So, by the way, there's a way of confirming this in the next scientific investigation. But for the time being, let's just simply say this. How did all of this happen? Well, first of all, you're going to need some fissioning in the body. And that fissioning has to be for a very short amount of time. As I said, about 1/10,000th of a second. What happens, as I said, is when this fissioning actually happens, you're going to get that fluence of protons and deuterons about 2 times 10 to the 18th worth. That's 1/10,000,000,000th of the particles in that man's body are going to fly off of the body, and it's all the way through the body, throughout the body. That's how you get the imaging from the inside. So these things have to fly at 1/10,000,000,000th of those particles in 1/10,000th of a second. Now, here's the question for scientists, everybody in physics. Well, what could possibly be the source of fissioning? How would you get this low temperature nuclear reaction taking place throughout the body? How could you get this fissioning started? How could that be? Because there's no source of the energy needed for fissioning in the tomb, in limestone, in a shroud, in a body. We have no such thing. I mean, the only source of the energy to produce the fissioning has to come from, well, outside. Let's call that a supernatural cause just for a moment. But then we have the much stranger phenomena of these blood stains. And you look at the blood stains, and they're perfect blood stains. They have edges. They have contraction halos. I mean, over 100 nearly perfect bloodstains. I mean, truly nearly perfect bloodstains. Hardly.
What do you mean by nearly
just
perfect bloodstains?
no flecking, no smearing, no segmenting, no fragmenting. You know, like I said, the edges of the bloodstains are perfectly intact. The contraction halos, when the blood is drying, it leaves behind a little thing we call contraction halo. Even those are sitting there right on the surface of that shroud. Now, here is the problem, the mystery. The mystery is, how can you, most of that blood would have been dried on the body. We know that the source of radiation happened 36 hours after the body gets in the tomb, more or less, but pretty close to 36 hours. Now, that means that all of the blood has to be dried on the skin of the shroud man. Well, not all of it. There might have been some postmortem bleeding, but minimal compared to all the dried blood. Now, you look at that for just one second, you go, wait a minute. Dried blood isn't going to just stick perfectly without any flecking, smearing, segmenting, fragmenting. It's not going to stick perfectly on that cloth. That's just cannot happen. But it did. So what's the explanation of it? The explanation is radiation pressure. So remember, these protons, deuterons, and neutrons, they're getting emitted by the body, but the blood is stopping it. So you've got all these protons and deuterons and neutrons, and they're building up underneath the blood, but over the skin. And so that radiation pressure hits a critical point at 1/10,000th of a second. And then when it occurs, it's like these bloodstains, like they go flap, 100%. Every single particle in that blood is transformed, and because the blood is warmed up because of the radiation pressure, right, it's going to stick to that cloth. Now, here is the real interesting fact. Now that the blood has been warmed up and it's sticking on the cloth perfectly, if the body stays, in the cloth, then that cloth is going to just simply recede back and touch the skin again of the body, and the blood's going to start sticking to the skin again. Mm-hmm. So if anybody tried to remove the shroud post-mortem, right, so let's suppose the apostles were sneaky and went into the tomb and tried to take the shroud off and pretend that the body was stolen, right, and left the shroud behind, they would, of course, if the blood had restuck to the skin, every one of those blood stains would have had fragmenting, segmenting, smearing, flecking of every imaginable form, but they don't.
That was the Best of the Week on Relevant Radio. The best way to listen to the Best of the Week is on the Relevant Radio app, free and always free. Download and share the #1 free Catholic app today in the App Store.